Melter broke the most sacred rule of the royal guard in front of the entire nation, but when you find out why, you'll understand why the world stood still. He believed that honor sometimes means breaking the rules. Then you have to watch this to the end. But before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below where you're watching from. Your support helps us keep telling real stories that move the heart. Now let's go back to that historic day in London. Sergeant Lucas Bennet stood motionless on the grey stone of the Mall. His scarlet tunic burned against a sea of morning black, the white trim of his uniform spotless despite the cold drizzle hanging in the air. His bearskin hat added nearly a foot to his frame, and his rifle rested perfectly against his shoulder, unmoving. 15 years in the Royal Guard had taught him discipline. Unshakable, unbreakable, his face like stone, his breathing steady. His orders were clear: remain still no matter what. It was the Queen's funeral procession. The nation held its breath. A silence unlike any Lucas experience gripped the crowd. And then he saw him, an elderly man in the crowd, wobbling, almost invisible to the thousands around him, but not to Lucas. The man wasn't just any bystander. He was someone Lucas had once promised he would never abandon. And in that moment, a quiet battle began between duty and humanity. Stay with us, because what Sergeant Bennet does next would shake the very foundation of royal protocol and make history for all the right reasons. As the Queen's coffin drew closer, Sergeant Lucas Bennet's eyes did what years of training had taught them not to do: break the illusion of absolute stillness. A flicker, a scan, a memory long buried began to resurface. Just beyond the black iron barrier stood a figure who should have been seated among dignitaries, not lost in the crowd. Harold Whitmore, the Queen's personal footman for over 60 years, was barely visible behind rows of onlookers. His frame had thinned, his shoulders slouched, but Lucas recognized him instantly. The world might have seen a tired old man in a black suit. Lucas saw the man who had once saved him. From failure, from despair, from himself. 15 years ago, Lucas was a newly inducted guard, young, proud, and already breaking under the weight of perfection. He had stood frozen for hours during his first shift at Buckingham Palace, legs aching, vision blurring. It was Harold, silently carrying a silver tea tray, who noticed his discomfort. Without pause, he whispered, "Wiggle your toes, lad. No one will see. Keeps the blood flowing." That quiet tip had kept Lucas from collapsing. But more than that, it sparked an unexpected bond between two men on opposite ends of service. Over countless brief encounters passing each other in the palace halls, sharing tea in tucked-away kitchens, Lucas grew to respect Harold as more than a palace fixture. He was living memory, a relic of royal history, a man whose loyalty to the Queen was absolute. 2 years ago, at a summer garden party, they shared one final conversation under a cherry tree in full bloom. Harold's voice had been thin, almost brittle. "Pancreatic," he'd said. "The doctors don't give me long. When her time comes, I fear I won't be able to say goodbye properly." Lucas remembered the tremor in Harold's hand and the clarity in his voice when he said, "If that day comes, would you help an old man find his place to say farewell?" Lucas had answered without hesitation, "You have my word." And now that promise stood before him, frail and alone. The ceremonial music swelled. The gun carriage was only minutes away. No one noticed Harold's hand press suddenly against his ribcage, or the way his knees buckled slightly beneath him. But Lucas noticed everything. His orders were clear: remain still. His career depended on it, but so did his conscience. Captain Brennan stood yards away, his jaw tight, his posture immaculate. One glance at the commander, then back at Harold. Lucas knew the weight of what he was about to do. But there are moments when honor demands action, even at the cost of everything else. In that second, Lucas Bennet understood. Keeping a promise to a dying man was not a betrayal of duty. It was the very essence of it. And so, with one breath, he broke formation. With the clarity that only comes in the most critical moments, Sergeant Lucas Bennet inhaled deeply. It was not the kind of breath his training had taught him to take. It was fuller, heavier, the kind of breath one takes before leaping into uncertainty. Then he moved. The precision with which Lucas turned on his heel was so flawless, so exacting, that for a fraction of a second those watching might have thought it was part of the ceremony, a drill, a cue, something rehearsed. But when his boots left the ceremonial track and carried him into the crowd, that illusion shattered. Ripples. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Murmurs stirred like wind through trees. The man in the red tunic, so regal, so immovable, was walking. Lucas walked straight, shoulders squared, white-gloved hands still gripping his rifle, as if his posture alone could justify what he was doing. Each step was deliberate, his expression unreadable. The crowd, sensing something sacred was happening, parted wordlessly, awestruck by the calm certainty in his movement. Harold Whitmore looked up, startled by the sudden approach. His eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment he seemed ready to protest. But Lucas offered no words. Speaking would only further breach protocol. Instead, he extended his arm, offering support with the dignity of a royal escort. Harold hesitated. Then, with a subtle nod, he allowed himself to be led. Together they moved toward the front barrier. Lucas guided Harold with the same ceremony he would reserve for a foreign dignitary. The crowd, previously wrapped in silence, now watched with reverent attention. Behind them, Captain Brennan's jaw visibly clenched. His face transitioned through disbelief, outrage, and finally something closer to fear. This was unprecedented. The Royal Guard did not move. Ever. 7 steps, that was all it took. 7 perfect steps brought Harold to the front of the line, directly adjacent to the very position Lucas had just vacated. From here, the elderly man could now see the approaching gun carriage clearly. One last glimpse of the woman he had served for more than 60 years. Harold's hand trembled. Lucas subtly adjusted his stance, positioning himself behind the old man like a wall against the world. No words, no grand gestures, just presence. As the Queen's coffin passed, draped in the royal standard, Harold straightened with visible effort. His thin arm lifted in a final salute, slow, fragile, yet rich with meaning, a goodbye decades in the making. The procession continued, unaware of the silent defiance that had just taken place. Then, with the same grace as his departure, Lucas returned to his post. Every step back was as sharp as the first. When he resumed his stance, it was as if he had never moved. Except now, his heart beat louder in his chest. He had broken the unbreakable rule, and yet he had kept the unbreakable promise. As Sergeant Lucas Bennet settled back into position, the air around him felt heavier than his bearskin cap. Every heartbeat echoed like a drumbeat beneath his uniform, but his face remained unreadable. Discipline, after all, had been drilled into every fiber of his being, but he knew the cost of what he'd just done. Behind him, Captain Brennan didn't move. He didn't need to. The fury in his eyes was enough to sear through the solemnity of the funeral procession. Lucas could feel it like heat against the back of his neck. The other guards didn't speak, didn't flinch, but their posture had subtly shifted. There was tension now. One man had broken rank, and everyone felt it. The rest of the ceremony proceeded flawlessly, but Lucas wasn't hearing the music anymore. His mind was stuck in that single moment. Harold's salute, the tremble in his hand, and the quiet way he had whispered, "You kept your promise, lad," had been worth it. When the final notes of the procession faded and the crowd began to disperse, Captain Brennan marched toward him. His voice was low, sharp, and controlled. "Sergeant Bennett, you will report to headquarters immediately following today's duties." There was no explanation needed. Lucas simply responded, "Yes, sir." 3 hours later, 2 senior guards escorted him down a quiet London street. The headquarters building stood ahead, stately, proud, now looming with judgment. But just as they turned the corner, Lucas caught sight of a familiar figure. Harold was being helped into a black cab by a young man, his nephew no doubt. Before stepping in, Harold looked back. Their eyes met across the distance, and the old man raised a hand. A wave, a salute, a farewell. Lucas didn't wave back. He didn't need to. That small moment said everything. Inside headquarters, Lucas was led to a room lined with polished wood and adorned with portraits of commanders long gone. At the table sat Colonel Richard Hargraves, flanked by Captain Brennan and 2 other senior officers. The colonel's voice was calm, firm. "I've received Captain Brennan's preliminary report regarding your breach of protocol during today's procession." Lucas stood tall. "Sir, I accept full responsibility. I do not regret my actions, but I am prepared to accept the consequences." Captain Brennan leaned forward, his voice taut. "You abandoned your post during a state funeral, the most sacred of ceremonies, for a personal matter." Lucas didn't argue. He didn't justify. He simply nodded. But before judgment could be passed, a knock came at the door. A woman in a navy suit entered. Lady Victoria Hamilton, a senior representative from the royal household. She laid a sealed envelope on the table. "Before this panel reaches a verdict, there is something you should read. What was inside would change everything." And in that moment, every rigid belief in the room would be challenged. Not by defiance, but by grace. Colonel Hargreaves broke the red wax seal with deliberate care. Every man in the room leaned in, not physically, but mentally, bracing for the weight of royal intervention. Lady Victoria Hamilton's voice was composed, but carried a gravity that hushed even Captain Brennan. "This message comes directly from the royal household," she said. "It was written by Her Majesty's own hand and updated 18 months ago as part of her funeral wishes." Lucas didn't dare breathe. The colonel read the note silently at first. His eyebrows shifted slightly. Surprise, then contemplation. He looked up, his tone softer than before. "She specifically named Mr. Harold Whitmore in her funeral instructions," he said, "and wished for him to be included in the private Windsor service." His voice lowered. Due to his health, he could not attend, but she made it clear that his presence, wherever it might be, should be honored. He placed the note on the table and turned to Lucas. "Your actions fulfilled a wish the Queen herself documented." Captain Brennan's jaw tightened. His voice faltered slightly for the first time. "Even so, Sergeant Bennett broke formation." Lady Hamilton stepped forward. "There's more?" From her portfolio, she produced a second envelope, this one smaller, cream-colored, bearing the royal crest. She handed it directly to Lucas. "A personal note from the Queen's family. For you and Mr. Whitmore." Lucas accepted it with both hands, unsure if he should open it then or later. He chose later. The moment deserved silence. Colonel Hargraves stood. "This panel acknowledges that you breached ceremonial protocol during one of the most important state events of the century. However, given the exceptional circumstances, the Queen's explicit instructions, and the impact your actions had, the decision is as follows. Lucas stared straight ahead. You will forfeit 2 weeks' pay and undertake additional ceremonial duties over the next month. This incident will be noted in your record, but not as misconduct, rather as an act of human judgment under extraordinary conditions. Captain Brennan's lips pressed together, but he didn't argue. The room had shifted, and not in his favor. Colonel Hargraves stepped forward and extended a hand, something rarely done in formal military hearings. You honored the spirit of the guard, Sergeant, not just its rules. Lucas shook it firmly, but his voice trembled slightly. Thank you, sir. As he left the chamber, the afternoon light hit differently, softer, warmer. Outside, the chaos of ceremony had faded. He had expected disgrace, and instead found dignity. That evening, he visited Mr. Whitmore's modest flat just blocks from the palace. The old man opened the door slowly, leaning on a cane. Worth it? Harold asked, a faint smile on his lips. Lucas handed him the envelope. Every step. They didn't need to say more. The silence between them now held reverence, not regret. Sometimes, opportunity doesn't come with applause. It comes quietly, wrapped in duty, sealed in respect, and delivered by a trembling hand. Days passed, but the moment never left him. Sergeant Lucas Bennett resumed his duties with precision, his stance perfect, his rifle polished, his eyes steady. But something had changed inside him. The world still saw a royal guard, still saw the scarlet coat, the silent discipline, the rigid pride. But Lucas had begun to understand the deeper truth. A uniform doesn't make you loyal. The choice you make when no one expects it. That's where true loyalty lives. The additional ceremonial duties handed down as part of his disciplinary action were long and grueling. He stood for hours during daily rituals, trained junior guards under strict conditions, and oversaw inspections that stretched late into the night. Not once did he complain. What surprised him most were the small moments, unexpected nods from fellow guards, or the subtle shift in tone when Captain Brennan addressed him. It wasn't approval, not quite, but it wasn't contempt anymore either. Perhaps respect wrapped in formality. The moment that cemented everything came quietly. Weeks later, Lucas was posted at the palace gates when an elderly woman approached the railing with her granddaughter. The girl couldn't have been older than 10. She pointed at Lucas and whispered something. The woman leaned closer to the child and said softly, but just loud enough for Lucas to hear, "That's the one I told you about, the soldier who helped the old man see the queen." Lucas didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't speak. But his heart stirred in a way no medal or promotion ever could. He was no longer just a silent symbol in a red coat. He was a story, a living one, and people were passing it on. One evening, as autumn winds swept through London, Lucas visited Harold again. The old man's condition had declined, but his spirit had not. They sat in near silence, sipping tea from delicate china, the kind only someone who had served royalty would keep long after retirement. "You know," Harold said, voice thin but clear, "I've seen hundreds of men wear that uniform. Most wear it with pride, but very few carry its weight." Lucas looked at him. "What's the difference? Pride is about how you look. Weight is about what you carry when no one's watching." Lucas didn't reply. He didn't need to. That night, walking home beneath the glow of the palace lamps, Lucas realized he had become more than a soldier. He had become a bridge between tradition and compassion, between rule and reason. And in a world that often confuses strength with silence, he had found something deeper: purpose. It was a crisp morning when the letter arrived. Sealed in a plain white envelope, it bore no royal crest this time. Just neat handwriting that Lucas recognized instantly. It had been sent a week before Harold Whitmore passed away. The letter was brief, handwritten with shaky strokes, but each word landed like a stone in his chest. "I don't know if I'll see you again, lad, but I need you to know what you did, what you risked, meant more than 1,000 titles or medals. In that moment, you didn't just help an old man. You helped restore something we all forgot, that duty is not about standing still, but about standing up. God bless you." Lucas read it 3 times before carefully placing it in the same drawer where he kept his grandfather's war medal. Harold passed quietly 2 days later. The palace arranged a private farewell. Lucas stood in uniform once more, but not in formation. This time, he stood by the casket of the man who had whispered guidance to a trembling young soldier all those years ago. A handful of former royal staff gathered in silent reflection. There were no television cameras, no horses, no gun carriage, just modest service for a man who had spent his life making others shine. When the ceremony ended, Lucas stepped forward. He raised his arm in a crisp salute, held it longer than protocol required, then let it fall. Not for the public, not for tradition, for Harold. Later that day, back at his post outside Buckingham Palace, a tourist asked aloud, "Isn't he the one who broke the line for that old man?" Lucas spurned. But he didn't react. He didn't need to, because that story now lived in whispers, passed between strangers, told with reverence. And for a guard, that was immortality. What Lucas had done was no longer just an act of rebellion. It had become a symbol, a reminder that tradition isn't weakened by compassion, it's made stronger by it. In his final report, Colonel Hargraves had written, "Sergeant Bennett's actions broke protocol, but fulfilled something far greater, the monarchy's legacy of humanity." Those words stayed with Lucas long after Harold's letter had faded with time. Every time he stood at attention, eyes forward, rifle steady, he no longer felt like a statue. He felt like a man who had been tested and chosen right. Because sometimes the most powerful salute is the one the world doesn't see. In the quiet between duty and defiance, there lives a rare kind of courage. The kind that doesn't raise its voice, but lifts others. Sergeant Lucas Bennett reminded us that rules, though sacred, are sometimes meant to be bent in service of something greater, humanity. This story is not just about a soldier or a royal servant. It's about the unspoken promises we carry through life. It's about keeping your word even when no one would fault you for walking away. And perhaps more profoundly, it's about the choice to see someone who would otherwise be invisible to the world. For our older viewers, many of you know this feeling well. You've lived long enough to see the world change, sometimes too fast. You've watched people chase protocol over people, efficiency over empathy. And maybe, just maybe, you've wondered if anyone still remembers what real service looks like. Lucas did. In that one quiet act, he gave voice to a generation who knew loyalty not as a slogan, but as a way of living. He stood for someone who had stood for everyone else for over 60 years. And that may be the most noble form of gratitude there is. What we learn here is simple yet profound. Honor is not only about standing still, sometimes it's about moving forward towards someone in need. Tradition isn't destroyed by compassion, it's fulfilled by it. And when history watches, it will remember not just the uniform you wore, but who you chose to protect while wearing it. So now, we ask you, on a scale from 1 to 10, how deeply did this story move you? Would you have made the same choice in Lucas's position? Have you ever kept a promise others thought you'd forgotten? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one, and your wisdom matters here. If this story reminded you of someone in your life, someone who kept their word, who stood by you when rules said they shouldn't. Share this video with them. Let them know they're seen. Don't forget to like this video. Subscribe to our channel for more real stories that stir the soul. And if you believe that sometimes the greatest honor is found in the smallest act of kindness, then this channel is for you. We'll see you tomorrow. And until then, keep your promises, even when no one's watching.